Everybody, welcome back to the Insiders Lounge. Today we have another episode and another special guest. Sammy, thank you for joining me and feel free to introduce yourself.
No, pleasure to be here, Chad. Honoured to be asked to have an episode. And I'm Sammy Lander, for those that don't know me, and I am football's first substitutions coach, which is a little bit niche.
No, it's brilliant. I always like kicking things off because I think it gives a good understanding of the actual guests themselves. Your first soccer memory, what was it like? And you got to sort of talk me through it. Give me the sort of background of that.
Yeah, so my first soccer memory would probably be when I was sort of 5, 6, 7. And, we didn't live near a lot of grass. We was in a bit of sort of an estate. So I would always go out and play on the road. And it would be like sort of bouncing things off the curb and chesting your touch and that. And I used to create my own tournaments of teams. And I used to have, stacks and stacks of pages of just like tally charts where I would go out and almost like create tournaments and then go and like play the game out in the street, like me v me, run back in and like tally the result down and then, stick it up as a league table. And that was probably my earliest memory of, enjoying football and really sort of getting the playing side of it, but even at that age, just a little bit about, tally charts and league data and that sort of thing. That was a very, very good memory.
It reminds me, my friends and I used to play FIFA, and we would have sort of the same sort of thing. We would run tournaments, like just simulate tournaments. I think we wanted Football Manager, but we didn't have it at the time. So then we would just run, whether it was the World Cup or the Champions League, and then we would tally down and we would sort of start placing bets. And I'm talking, we were like 7, 8 years old, just placing bets on Champions League games that are not even real. So it feels the same. Yeah. I think it's the start of anyone that gets interested into scouting, analysts, that sort of thing. I think you start that from young, and you don't even realize it.
No, it was like amazing time, because there would even be times where like I would have like a team that I would want to win, and I'd go out and I'd like play the game and my team would lose, and I would come and be like, oh, we've lost. You know what I mean? And I have to tally that, and you can learn so many lessons from it.
No, you're spot on. One of the first interesting things that I saw while I was doing research, we were just talking about how many great articles and videos that are on you. The blindness in your right eye. I saw it and I was like, that's unbelievable. As an analyst or a scout, you would think your visualization of things is so important. So I'd love to, can you talk me through that sort of story and what happened there?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously playing career was always the goal anyways, when I was sort of young and growing up. And when I was 10, 11, I think it was, I was in quite an unfortunate car crash. It led to quite, some serious consequences, and it sort of put my physical development back and my mental development. I was in and out of hospital, 9, 10 surgeries, and, it led to me then losing the sight in my right eye, which you're right is mental for that first bit of my career when I said I was a scout and I couldn't see 50% of the picture. Maybe it was lead to a few laughs at the pub, but, it's just about compensating for that and having an open body, I suppose. But it's never held me back. If anything, it's probably been a lesson that has taught me to be resilient and accept that, there's going to be some things in life that are going to try and set you back, but you just got to try and keep putting one foot in front of the other. And again, the car crash was sort of my way of looking at my life and thinking, I probably can't play football. It's going to be tough. So what's the next best thing? How do I sort of navigate a career in football through a different pathway? And that's how I came across recruitment and analysis and coaching and that sort of side of things.
Yeah, I think it's always key that whenever there's a tragedy or something that happens to you, if you can look at the positive lens, and I think once you look back now, it's easier to look at it and go, oh, that was actually perfect. It aligned so well with what I wanted to do. But I think if you can look at it like in the moment of like, look, this is my reality. Can I make a positive anything out of this? Can I take a positive action out of this? And I think that's key. And look how well you've done now over the many years.
No, I appreciate that, and I agree. It's like you said, perspective and hindsight is a beautiful thing. So like I said, I can sit now here and say that I wouldn't change my past at all at the time. It probably took a little bit of time to process, and as it would as a young person. And I had this dream of playing football and stuff, but it's just about realigning your dream to a different pathway. It was never going to be over. I'm still going to win the Premier League, but rather than as a player, now as a coach or an analyst or something different.
And how has it adapted your sort of skills when we're looking at analysis and scouting? That sort of, you mentioned obviously you can't see out of the one eye, so you're having to adapt in that sense. But is there other ways that you sort of adapted that you might do work differently than other analysts or scouts?
I wouldn't have said so. No, obviously, I mean, I wouldn't probably be able to compare like for like,
Right.
someone with potentially that versus me. But, I wouldn't say it's ever sort of held me back or anything like that, just because, you still got one eye. And I think, that's probably a huge advantage in the stuff that we want to do is having that ability. So it teaches you to be, grateful for the stuff that you do have at times that you take for granted, I suppose.
So then let's get into that sort of transition stage from moving from a player to getting into sort of coaching, scouting, and analysis. When did that actually happen? You mentioned obviously you wanted to win the Premier League as a player. It didn't end up working out, but now you sort of have this new phase. So I'd love to hear that transitional phase and how that actually went through.
Yeah, so no one in my family's ever been involved in football. It's I've got a few granddads that like it and brothers that like it, but never someone who's played the game to a good level or been in a coaching role or anything like that. So for me, I was the first person to do it. So it was trying to find a way into a career. Particularly, we're from a really small town that didn't really offer opportunities. Our nearest football club's over an hour away. So
Wow.
stuff like that is natural hurdles, natural barriers that I'm sure everybody faces. So for me, it was trying to find a pathway, and I was quite fortunate that I saw an internship at AFC Bournemouth in the academy. As a sort of a recruitment scout for the academy, went and applied, managed to get it, drove to Bournemouth, sort of every day for 7 days across a year, and just took in as much as possible. And that was probably the first big step when I look back on it into a career in football, because the people you meet in football then can lead to more opportunities and more, and it snowballs. And you look back at it, and almost when you work backwards, everything that I've achieved today is because I saw that one internship and I thought, I've just got to go for it and make it work later and that sort of thing. So yeah, that was my first role, internship at Bournemouth.
What would you say was the most important step to actually getting that internship? I see a lot of analysts and scouts that are aspiring to work for professional clubs. They start a newsletter, or they're constantly tweeting their ideas, or they have some sort of project to sort of help promote, look, this is what I'm capable of doing. I'm curious what you had at the beginning where something like Bournemouth would say, hey, look, we have interest in Sammy, let's bring him on board, even if it's an internship.
Yeah, I think it was almost a project of myself. I sort of sat in front of them and said, look, I don't have any experience, probably next to what some of the other interns at the club do, but I want to win the Premier League. I want to be the best version of myself, and I want a career in football. And I'm willing to do everything it takes to, in order that make my reality. So it was a case of trying to pitch myself to them, for them to look at me and think, CV's not all that, because I was 17, 18 at the time. But we can see someone in him where we think if we give him a year, he might be able to add some value, add some different lens, different perspective, and let's give him a shot and see what he can do.
Yeah, we just finished recording the Pochettino episode on actually like the opinion base and get a better idea of how his fit will be with the U.S. men's national team. And Daniel Hall was on the episode, and he mentioned the idea of fit, that he said in the hiring process, you really just look at the person. Many of their resumes or their CVs will look the same. They'll have the similar sort of backgrounds, but now it's a matter of like, how is this person going to fit within our organization? And do we follow sort of those same strategies towards what we want in the long term? And I think that's what you're saying there, where, yeah, sure, they looked at a 17, 18-year-old and look, he doesn't really have any experience. He's not really going to fit anywhere. But hey, how is he as a person, and can he grow into something with potential? And does he have that potential for growth? And I think that's what you sort of nailed down.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a nice way to frame it as well.
Sometimes you can work on yourself rather than, you might have a project or something else that you work on, but sometimes it's just a matter of like, can I get myself to be the one that's sort of shining the light of my skills and my abilities that I might have later on down the line. I just don't have them now. I think it's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, you have to project your potential. You have to project your potential to them and get them to see, I can see it. I think I'm going to be good in football. I believe I can do this and I can do this and win the Premier League and all these, I can see it. But getting someone else to see that is challenging, I suppose, because, looking at a 17-year-old kid, you might not think that he's going to deliver, but that projecting of your potential is important in that first interaction, I think.
We were speaking about the video that The Athletic done, so I would love to sort of move on just sort of through the early stages of your career now, working in coaching and analysis, but especially with Weymouth. I think that was is that how you say it, Weymouth?
Yeah, Weymouth, yeah.
Weymouth, yeah. So I loved that story. I thought it was, I feel like I was watching a movie at the time when I was watching it. So talk us through sort of those early stages of your career then, and then sort of that ultimate action that happened at Weymouth that like sort of set you on a whole new trajectory.
Yeah, so at Bournemouth, the manager of Weymouth at the time was also the AFC Bournemouth 23s manager. So there was sort of a crossover there because Weymouth were in non-league, so it was sort of a dual role that he could balance. Through Bournemouth, I obviously got to meet some people, and I managed to meet Mark Molesley, who was the manager, and we exchanged a little bit of detail on the game, our thoughts, a little bit of my work, and he said there's an opportunity at Weymouth. Again, internship. It's going to be a little bit of analysis work for you. Might be a little bit of an opportunity to coach. Would be interested. And I thought, yeah, like this is it. This is first team football. This is where I want to be. This is what drives me. That need to win and results driven. I really thrive off that sort of competitiveness. So I was like, yeah, definitely, like, get me involved. And I look back on it, it's mad. I was 20 at the time, and I was in a hurry in my career, which I probably should have been a little bit more patient. But that's, again, a hindsight moment. But I was 20 and I was like, I want this. So I was effectively a first team coach, first team analyst at 20 in non-league football. And we, as a collective, did really, really well at Weymouth. We won 2 promotions back to back, and it put us into what was almost a full-time league. So they call it the National League in the English Pyramid. So, we went from Southern Prem into the National South, won it into the National League, and we were coming up against full-time teams. We were still a part-time team that would train on a Tuesday and a Thursday. We'd have to share our pitch with some grassroots team because we couldn't afford to book the whole pitch, and we were coming up against Notts Counties, Wrexhams, Chesterfields, who had big budgets. So for us, it was a real challenge and the need to be resourceful in our approach to try and match teams that we were kind of against because they had so much more than us. And then we got through to COVID, and that sort of the light bulb moment that you're referring to there is we went through COVID. We had to furlough some players because we couldn't afford to keep the club running. COVID had wiped out a few players, and it just came to an FA Cup game. We're playing Maidenhead. I don't think anything of it. I know at training it was light, and I put some good displays in, for training. I've been centre back a few times, and I've played some nice passes, and because I'm just there to step in when the coach needs me. But there was a moment when I got the call, and he was just like, "Can you get in a bit early today?" And it was like, "All right, I'll be there." I don't think anything of it. And I get in, and there's this big Lander shirt on the wall. And I'm thinking, what? Like, what's that? Like, I'm in. This is it. This is the career that when I was 10, 11, 12, thinking about, this is it, this could start it now. And yeah, I was a substitute that day because we didn't have enough to fill the bench. So they named me as a substitute. And yeah, I experienced the game as a substitute. And obviously there was one particular moment where our striker's gone down injured. Managers turned to me and said, "Are you ready to come on?" And I'm sort of just sat in my bench coat, like watching the game, thinking like, God, I don't know what we're going to do here. The striker's down. Like, we might be able to put him at right back and move our, you know what I mean? I'm thinking about the solution. And then I realise he's talking to me, and it's like I'm ready to come on. And so I'm stripped down, I'm shin pads on, I'm shorts on, Landers on the back, and I'm ready to go and make a diamond career. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, the striker jumped up, and I never got those minutes. But like you said, that was the moment where I was like, wow, like if I feel like this, there's got to be other players, coaches, anyone in football that can resonate with this sort of feeling that I had as a substitute.
All right, so you gave us kind of that initial event of like, okay, this is the realization of what a substitutions coach could then become. You realize, look, I'm the substitute. I'm freezing cold in my jacket. Now I have to get on and go and make an impact. Yeah. I'm curious if we go back now, was there anything that you could sort of see when you were younger that like, maybe I could go down this route of being, we'll start generally just as like an analyst or a coach. Like, what were some of those initial things where you go, okay, yeah, this might be interesting later on? And then also specifically into sort of the substitution side, was that ever a thought, or could you ever see yourself sort of heading that direction?
I've always been a little bit sort of innovative. Like, the way I think about football is a little bit different. And I like to try and go against the grain at times, just to try and challenge things and understand whether the quote I always use is results over tradition. So don't just do things because that's the way they've always been done. Try and find results to suggest that that's actually the right way to do it, or the most effective way. So I had this little book at home, which I call an ideas book, and all sorts of different ideas that I've observed in football, from 3 years working at Weymouth as a young coach, just things I've noticed, whether I think, wow, that can't be the only way that we do that, or the way you place water bottles at training and games, why do we have to bring them in to have them? Why can't we dot them around? And little things where you think, I might be able to do that differently. And this was just another one of those incidents where I thought, substitutions, like, let me write that down, because there's no way that me feeling like this is going to be beneficial to the manager, to the team, to the coach, to my own career. Like, this isn't going to be an effective substitution if you brought me on right now. So yeah, it was one of those moments where I thought, let me go into this a little bit further and see if there's actually data to suggest that substitutes are effective or aren't. So, and I always knew that, again, my background's not really been that I suppose big in football, professional football. So in order to try and make a name for yourself in professional football, it's always a little bit more challenging. And so I needed something that was going to give me a platform. And I was very fortunate that the substitution sort of concept came about as that time, really.
It reminds me of that sort of like childlike curiosity where I spent some time this summer with a Premier League player, and he had the same sort of thing where he was always just asking questions, and you almost think like, oh yeah, you are 29 years old or you are 30 years old, but he almost asked questions as if I was with like a younger brother. But it's sort of that concept of like, okay, if just because something is happening doesn't mean it should happen that way. Like maybe we can try something new and try and innovate. And I think that's where the biggest innovators in the world constantly ask those questions. And I think that's sort of what you're leading to, where just because subs are done this way doesn't mean we should do it this way. And I think the more questions you ask, then the more you can actually solve in that sense.
Yeah, exactly that. Like I honestly think there are so many things in football that when you actually like break it down to an isolated incident and you think like, wow, like for one of the most competitive sports in the world, where each goal in the Premier League is worth so many millions, each position's worth so many millions, like can we afford to not address this, or can we afford to just accept this? And so yeah, it's that I like that curiosity where you think, can I do this better? Can I do this differently?
So let's get into your role specifically now. I want to just sort of give a deep dive. If someone has, we're now almost 20 minutes in. If someone has no clue about what we're talking about right now, what does your role actually look like, and what are you sort of innovating now that we're talking about innovation?
So my job is to go in and modernize the role of a substitute, try and update it to the, trend that football is today, which is very forward thinking and modern. So I modernize the role of a substitute, and I do that through my people and data driven approach. It's very important that there are two parts of the concept. It's not all just about the numbers and not just all about the person. It's about combining those to create the solution. And I say, the more deliberate you can be with the topic, the more consistent and effective that topic will become. And that's what I do with substitutions, is I find ways to be deliberate, whether that's how you substitute, when you substitute, who you substitute, and the intervals and all the different things around the topic of a substitution is effectively driven my research to try and find better ways to do that. And, I had some really, really cool experiences, both with the data and the people-driven part of the concept. And I'm pleased with sort of the impact that I've made to date with the use of substitutions.
So I'm going to ask a bit of a forward question in a sense, where I'm going to say, if I'm a manager or a club owner or something, and I'm listening to this now, what makes your role valuable? Why should I consider bringing you on board or working with you as a consultant? I
think because for me, there's a lot of parts that can get overlooked with the substitution process. I would actually argue that some clubs don't even have a substitution process. If you think about the actual regime that they go through, they don't really have much demand placed on them upon the warm-up. In the game, they're really left to their own devices. Half-time, they're sort of an afterthought. And then 70th minute, they're the most important person on the pitch. And it's that sort of build-up to that moment where you think that can't be the most effective way for that to happen. And what I do is I come in and I keep the substitutes accountable and centralize a lot of information and data for them to then sort of go back to the manager and make the suggestions, just as any expert would in any department. I always say goalkeeping coaches, for me, one of the best specialist coaches in football, because their job is to keep goalkeepers engaged throughout the season, give all the manager the knowledge, make sure they're trained and coached to the highest level so they can perform. And, as people, they're okay. All these different things that a goalkeeper coach does. Well, my role is almost pitched as, well, I'll come in and I'll do that with the substitutes, and I can make sure that these subs are performing, so that when it comes to that 72nd minute, nothing is left to chance. We've covered every single base for them in the build-up. And now when they go and perform, we have a reason as to why they've gone on to perform.
I think it's a really good comparison between a goalkeeper coach and yourself. I think goalkeeping coaches, you have that idea where one goalie is going to play about 90% of the minutes, and then that second goalie might play 10, and then that last goalie is probably not going to play any. And so you also have to compare and make them feel okay with their own position in the team itself, like what is their actual role within the team, and then giving them that constant motivation throughout the season, where 9 months in, that third goalkeeper is still motivated just in case there is an injury or something goes wrong. And I think as the subs, it's sort of the same. They have to know that their role is just as important. Like you said, that 70th minute hits, they're the most important player on that team now if they're coming on. So I think it's keeping them motivated, keeping them inspired, but then also bringing in the data and all the analysis to go, look, you're actually way more important than you think you are. So now this last 20 minutes that you're on the field, let's make sure that's the biggest impact possible.
Yeah, that's absolutely it. It's nailed it. And there is so much, again, that's more sort of the people side of it. And then there's that data side that also suggests that substitutes are so ineffective in today's game. You know, there are so many examples where substitute, like the average pass completion of a substitute in a Premier League, I think last year was 66%. And you just think if you make 5 substitutes now and you bring 5 players on who are all going to average 66% pass completion, that's going to seriously affect your control that you have in a game, the momentum you have in a game. You know, there was a study that we did that showed, I think it was 70% of substitutes lose their first duel and then 60% lose their second duel. And you think,
Wow.
well, you've just made 5 subs and all 5 have gone on to lose their first 2 duels or the majority of them. How's that going to affect the swing of this game? You know, that's now 0-0, 1-0, 2-1, you know, where there's such fine margins. And again, I don't think maybe people in football really think about substitutes like that. They don't look at the individual contribution, and that's sort of what I take a lot of pride in.
I listened to a podcast called My First Million. It's a business-based podcast, but they have this idea of a one graph business. So it's the idea that you can show someone one graph and you can sell a business on it. So I'm curious, your one graph. I know, like we were discussing the Aston Villa graph that you did on the
Yes.
weekend, and sort of the information behind expected impact. So maybe if we want to dive into what is expected impact and what is a one graph that you could show to say, okay, this is my value as a substitution coach. You mentioned obviously the idea where a lot of 70% lose their first touch, that sort of thing. So I think diving into that would be interesting. Expected impact, and then what your role or a graph around your role that makes it actually valuable.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the graph would incorporate expected impact. So like you said, it's the Aston Villa piece that I put up on my LinkedIn recently, and you know, if you're unsure, go and check it out. But it's sort of an expected impact down one side, and then sort of an outcome metric, which we call points per game per substitute, down the bottom. And it almost mixes the outcome metric with a process metric. So we're almost comparing performance and scoreline. Whereas I feel like when you look at substitutes, a lot of people tend to just assess them by the outcome, which can sometimes mean it gets overlooked a little bit or papered over. This really addresses how they've impacted the game and if they've impacted the actual scoreline as well. So yeah, that would probably be my one graph, because on this graph I can also put, for Aston Villa, I put the average Premier League substitute. I could also put the average substitute that I've worked with and you know, highlight the impact that maybe I could bring, the percents that I can, you know, bring across a season to player development, positive scorelines. But that would probably be the graph. And then, yeah, just touching on expected impact, it's sort of the value that I've sort of put into the footballing world at the moment to try and assign a numerical value to a substitute, because I think at the moment there isn't really that existing in football. And what it aims to do is expected impact offers this value, and it assesses the value added or loss in performance for when a substitute has entered the game, you know, the effect that they've had on performance. And I don't think it's the final development, you know, just as with expected goals and every other metric in football, there will be layers added and it will keep developing, and you know, but it's a really nice staple where managers can now just look at a number and go, yeah, he was effective or he was ineffective. And that's been my aim of that metric, really, is to try and give managers more information in almost one summary to say, was it a good sub or a bad sub?
Have you read How to Win the Premier League by Ian Graham?
I'm about 2 chapters in. Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm a little bit ahead of you now. I think I'm like 150 pages in, but he goes through one of the chapters and he's just constantly questioning his own database that he's been building.
Yeah.
And I think that's the idea that you just mentioned there, that like he builds it, then he realizes, or he starts speaking to someone else and they say, oh no, you haven't thought of this. Or he reads old databases or old pieces of information. And he realizes, oh, I've missed this. And he's constantly renewing this feed. And it's slowly getting better and better. But I think even to this day, I'm sure he's still questioning it and still changing it. And I think that's the beauty of it, that there's just so much data, and it sort of keeps advancing, that you'll never have a perfect database or a perfect system that'll always work. And that's the importance. Again, we were talking about childlike curiosity, where you're just constantly curious and constantly finding ways to re-innovate. And that's how you'll get sort of that best database or analysis system.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's a great way to frame it, because I always say that there's very rarely going to be one metric to summarize a substitute, because their performance is so holistic. You know, it's one of the roles that updates minute by minute, but they'll have no direct involvement in that game. So it is really hard to try and find one to say that's what we want or that's what we need. So there will definitely be sort of layers added, and that's why that holistic process is important. That this metric comes alongside other samples of analysis that we'll touch on a little bit later on about the role. So it forms part of a bigger picture that allows you to assess the initial impact that maybe that substitute has or hasn't.
Yeah, it reminds me of like James Milner used to come on for Liverpool as a left midfield, right midfield. Then he'd be a right back. Then he'd start playing CDM. Like he was all over the place, but it's just dependent on where we needed him and how do you actually measure that? How do you measure the impact of what Milner has now done for you? So I actually had a question. How do you measure the impact now of what makes a super sub a super sub? We speak of these players that come off the bench. I know an early one for me was Chicharito for Man United. It just seemed he always came on and always scored, but is there actually data behind that backs that up? I think in the Aston Villa example, John Duran has had a brilliant start to the season. I remember watching him at Chicago Fire, brilliant player. So is there actually a measurement now? You've spoken on expected impact, but what makes a super sub a super sub? Why is he so strong off of the bench?
It's a good question, and I would say that the initial starting point of that question has to be, what does the manager want? Because you're sort of referring to super subs there as subs that have come on and scored goals, and that's massive. That's a massive part of football, But there are substitutes who have been brought on in 20 game-winning states and have maintained a lead across all 20, and so they might be the ultimate closer. They might be the best super sub when you're winning. So the sort of thing I'm getting at here is you have to ask managers what they want from that substitute first, because if you tell me what you want, I can go and create an education and craft a system and a process that allows me to create that substitute. So for Chicharito, he's a player that maybe was always relied on in losing game states. So can we design a process and a way of analysing him in losing game states to show his impact? For Man City, very rarely are they behind. So their substitutes look completely different. And it's all about how can you create a winning substitute? How can you create a substitute that promotes game management, promotes the ability to maintain the ball, because it's very specific to Guardiola's style of play. So for me, again, it's so holistic and it's so important on what the manager needs from his substitute. And I think once you answer that question, you can then start going into the layers of, this might need a little bit more of a data-driven approach. This might need a little bit more clarity from the player on his role. This might need expected impact to help us. This might need impact time, which helps us define at what time we make those substitutes. It's all those sort of then follow-up questions that originate from that first answer.
One of your first big breakthroughs was at Weymouth. We were discussing that, but Wimbledon was also sort of another breakthrough. And I was really fascinated on the idea of you constantly building trust at that club. So can we talk about your time at Wimbledon, sort of how it began and that transition phase into the club, and then actually while you were at the club, sort of that aspect of building trust with them?
Yeah, so the Wimbledon opportunity came about when through COVID, and obviously I was at Weymouth, first team coach. I would reach out to people on LinkedIn that I'd seen, connected with, and just said, look, can I borrow 15 minutes of your time, pick your brains on qualifications, network, coaching pathways, experience, anything. And, I would say that I took a lot of rejections, but there were some people that did offer me the opportunity to call, which was very kind. And one of those people was Andy Parslow, who was a set piece coach at Wimbledon at the time. And just at the end of the phone call, just as they were going, I'd always just get in there and say, I've just got this idea about substitutes. Do you think I could pitch it to you? And Andy was one of the people that said, yeah, I'd love to hear it. And, the call then went on a little bit longer as I talked him through the concept physically, tactically, technically, psychologically, how he could work with these players. And he said, that's really interesting. Let me talk to Robbo, the manager, and see if we can invite you in. And obviously spoke to Robbo. Robbo really enjoyed the concept. He's very forward thinking and very humble in his leadership. If he thinks there's a weakness in his team, he wants to know about it, because as a collective, he wants to be the most effective. So he invited me in. I went, I pitched, everybody loved it. And it sort of grew from there that the opportunity was offered. So, the way that it came about was, again, me sort of putting myself out there, but I was very fortunate that there were some people out there that offered me their time to pitch the idea.
You mentioned the education aspect there of actually showing them and then getting that understanding of like, look, this is what I'm doing. I think that's sort of what we're doing here. We're asking a lot of questions to get a better idea of it. How do you actually approach that? Because obviously, I think I saw, I don't know if it was on your LinkedIn or where, but you want to share information about it so that people can get a better understanding, but it's also all the value that you've built up into this point. So you kind of have to have that balance of like, I want to share my information, but I also want to keep it to myself because this is what I've built up. So how do you actually balance that? How do you, because I know you're now consulting with many clubs sort of around the world. And I'm curious how you could potentially maybe start a course. The idea behind it was there's all these coaching credits and coaching courses that you can do, but there's nothing near sort of this system of what you've built. So I'm curious how you're now able to balance educating, but also keeping the value to what you've been able to build.
Yeah, it is tough, and it links in with your last question a little bit in sense of buying, coaches' trust. In that I have to show enough to convince you that what I'm doing is A, worthy, B, rationalized to paying a wage and paying a consultancy fee. I'm not just here to tell the subs to warm up. There's a lot of layers to this that I have to show you. But B or C rather, not go and show too much that then clubs turn around and go, okay, like fair enough, that's what we're going to do now, but appreciate you coming in and thanks for your time. So it has been tough, and I would say one of the challenges I faced in my career is that I think I am young in this industry. I'm 27. I've been in football now for 7 years in and around first team football, and I'm still learning every day what you can and can't do, should or shouldn't do, the best way to do things. And this was exactly that process where I went into two teams, presented my stuff, and they did exactly what I referred to earlier. They said, that's absolutely brilliant. Like, we love all that. We're going to divide effectively your roll up between the rest of the backroom team. And thanks for your time. Again, stay in contact. If ever we can do anything, let us know. But it was like, well, that's not really what I'm after right now. So it is a process. It is definitely a process. So you have to try and find the right balance. And I think the best way to describe it is you have to show the content that probably is a little bit more publicly available to then opposed to the stuff that I spend hours in the background doing. One thing I would say to that, though, is obviously to this team, they split the roles up between the backroom team. But I always say that this role needs a certain type of person to fulfill. So, I while it was devastating to hear that, because I just travelled and done this presentation and done this with work, I still look and I still think I would have done that role better than how they would have done that role. Because it's my expertise, it's my career, it's my research, it's my specialist, it's what I feel passionate about. So, I almost I'm a little bit relaxed now about sharing this content because I believe, I don't think anyone will deliver it as well as I can deliver it because, I'm the one that's constantly thinking about the layers I can add, and I'm the one that's thinking I've dealt with 400 or 500 substitutes in the past. So you couldn't throw a situation at me now regarding a substitute that I hadn't probably handled already. And that experience now is giving me a little bit more confidence, I suppose, to share that content a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of now finding someone that sees the value in you. And I think someone will see that value in you. And then that's just where you can then build on and grow from that point.
Definitely. Yeah.
I want to get into, so now you've been in more of a consulting role now, working with clubs all over the world, like we mentioned. Can we talk through some of those experiences, some of the cool opportunities that you've had so far? And I'm curious the difference in many of the organizations, because you're working over different leagues, different continents. I'd love to hear how they sort of approach substitutes and how you found it working with the different clubs.
Yeah, it's been amazing. So obviously Wimbledon happened. I had this great year. We had the highest performing substitutes in the league. We were second in goal contributions. We had the most points gained from losing positions with substitutes on the pitch. All these great metrics and statistics. And I thought, like, wow, how can I now transfer what I've done here to sort of like a bigger scale? How can I take this to France? How can I take this to the US? How can I take this to Scotland? And and how can I take this to the Premier League maybe? And how do I expand this now? And again, the beauty of touches on again the last question. I don't mind sharing content because each league is so different to the next league because it's so different on trends, fixture schedules, the travel. Like an away game in England is obviously tough, but an away game in America is, a different level of travel. So, the patterns and things that I would suggest wouldn't be the same in America as it would be England because, you're traveling 10 hours for an away game in the US, but you might travel 3 hours in England. So the different fatigue levels will affect the day. And all this sort of what I call personable data that's relative to league you're working in is so important. And, even now I sit down and I do league to league to league, and very rarely is there a consistent trend amongst those leagues, which is nice for me because it keeps it so fresh and it keeps it so new. And I'm thinking, wow, if that works in that league, maybe I could bring that league's trend over to this league to see if it can work. They always do 4 subs at a time, and it's had really, really good success for this reason. Do you think I could try and get that working in this league because it's similar conditions? And it's been such a good experience. And the one I would say is most different is working from club football to international football. I'd say that's probably been my biggest learning curve, because at club football there is an education. I come into a team and they say, look, we've got 10, 11 players that aren't playing week in, week out. They're your guys. They're the guys that you're going to have to go and turn in to match winners, energizers, closers. That's what we need you to do. And so I have to go in, I have to deliver this big education, this process, all the strategies I implement to get these 11 players to be the highest performing substitutes that we can. When you go international football, I went into a team the other day, or an international side, and they show me their pool of players. I've got about 2,000 players to pick from, and I'm thinking, well, I've just got to go through the data and find the best subs that fit the game states and the KPIs that you need to do it. So I think it's such a different process, because in club football you have to educate them for them to become what you need. In international football you have the luxury where you can scour your whole, that country's nation to find the 12 best players that you think are best for certain game states and KPIs and game model, philosophy. So it was a very good experience to sort of balance that out. And again, you can sort of merge in the middle to create sort of some hybrid. But it's been a really, really good experience. And yeah, I feel very, very lucky to have experienced so many different cultures.
We spoke about building trust with managers, obviously your time at Wimbledon. I'm curious about building trust with players. Obviously, approaching players now, it's a bit unique. They're not used to it either. So I'm curious your experience you've had working with players and actually their feedback. What are they saying about this role and about what the actual information that you're giving them?
It's been a brilliant process. I can honestly say there's been arguments and there's been challenges, but I've never had a single player resist the process. Never, because it's fixing their problem. They're the ones that struggle. So when I started this concept, I went and I interviewed as many players and coaches as I could about the experiences of a substitute. So I said, just talk to me. What's it like being a substitute? How do you get told you're a substitute? How does that make you feel? What's the hardest thing about being a substitute? And all these answers came back, and every single player was exactly the same. It was tough. It's tough entering a game. It's isolating. You feel very left out. You feel defeated. You don't really know what the word impact means. When someone slaps you on the back and says, go win a game of football, no one knows what that means. Do you know what I mean? So all these things is what players resonated with. So for me, it's been a privilege going in and helping them sort of fix an issue in their footballing experience, because no one is ever going to be exempt from being a substitute in football. It's a process that everybody has to go through, and Messi, Ronaldo have been a substitute, so if they can be, then everyone has to be, and so it's something that players can never avoid. So let's address it from minute one. And I would say that this is probably the best part of the concept, is some of the relationships I've made through players, where we sit down and it might be just understanding why they feel like that, because Minutes was his identity, for example. And so we have to now create a new identity in football. And it might be, let's create a substitute in football. And all these little things are like major culture changes and major wins for the people and the psychological sort of side of this role. And yeah, I think coaches probably take more persuasion than players do, which is interesting, because I thought it would have been the other way around. But it's been a really, really nice part of the role, that and the thing that I'm probably proudest the most.
I want to get into, we have some players that you see where they're let's say a young substitute, 17, 18, 19 years old, then they make quite a few good appearances, they get into a starting lineup, and then they seem to almost fall back a few steps where they're just not quite that same player. Have you been able to sort of see that evolvement with some players where they go from a sub, even if they're even more matured and 20, 30 years old, they get into a few good sub appearances, they get in the starting 11, and they just don't quite break that starting 11. They're not quite the same player. I'm curious your experiences around that sort of environment. Yeah,
it's an interesting question. I think I see a career as almost a full cycle. When you're old, sometimes you accept being a substitute, and when you're young, sometimes you accept. Sort of the higher you go on that circle, the more minutes and fame you demand, and then it comes sort of back down, and you're happy to accept that role again. So the people that are the start and the end of their journey, it might just be the case that they're just better substitutes than they are starters. That just might be the reality, that their career has taken that sort of cycle or that route now, and it's a case now of embracing that and going, look, we've identified these good things from you as a substitute. Let's build on that, and that's how we'll trade you. We'll put you as this super sub, and then when you mature, you'll then start to understand, and then it comes into a little bit more of individual development and working with players to project their substitute data into a starter data. But that comes sort of from more the traditional coaches rather than myself. But I would say a lot more of the time it's about trying to get players to reflect their starting data in their substitute data. That's probably been the biggest challenge, which is obviously the reverse of your question a little bit, where it's players will tend to be a really good starter, and then they'll come to the substitutes bench thinking, well, if he can do it as a starter, he can definitely do it as a sub.
Interesting,
yeah. And then it'll be the opposite of where they then go and have 33% pass completion, duels won, don't register a key pass, cross completion. All these different things that we look at is a lot lower than probably their starting standard compared to their substitute standard. So I know that probably contradicts your question a little bit.
No, that's good.
That's probably a little bit more of the thing I have to address when I go and work.
One of the things that I wanted to mention before I forget was the idea of substitutes warm-ups. So you see throughout the game, let's say halftime for an example, you'll see a lot of the subs just sort of ping a ball literally across the field back and forth to each other. And then just before they come on, they do a quick sort of cone drill and then they come straight on. Have you changed or adapted that process? I'm curious the process around actually warming up a substitute.
Yeah, so as part of this role, we've implemented, I think, 19 strategies. That's what we implement from Monday to Sunday. The substitutes take 19 things differently opposed to a normal club or a more traditional club or a club that don't have a substitute process. And one of the things that we've implemented is halftime sessions. We will have a session at halftime for the substitutes. We will do a 15-minute training session because it's their last time to touch the football before they potentially go on and deliver this high-value match-winning moment. Secondly, one of my biggest bugbears, Chad, like you just touched on, is when they go down the touchline and they leisurely drop to a knee, sometimes open the gate, chat to their mate who's on the opposition team, and then just stroll back up. Never a warm-up that's going to go and unleash the physical potential of a substitute. And lastly, it puts demand on them. It puts value on them. We're saying in this pattern of play, this is what we want you to do in the second half. We have identified this weakness in the opposition. Let's go and train it for 15 minutes. So when you come on and the manager says, go win us the game, or we want you to do this, you have complete direction in where you need to go and what you need to do to win the game of football. So yeah, halftime sessions is one of the biggest things that I think is so valuable to an experience of a substitute.
Before we move on, I normally ask the question of what's your favorite quote, what's something a quote that you live by, but I actually love two quotes that I found from you. So if I can, I'll say the quote, and then if you want to give your opinion on sort of where the context is around the quote. So the first one is, we call them finishers, not substitutes. I'd love to hear more clarification on that. Yeah,
so again, this comes from Eddie Jones, who in himself is just a genius with the way he operates in management and leadership. So yeah, that's a brilliant staple. To call people finishers, what we have done, because again, the word substitute comes with so many negative connotations, and you're almost fighting it from minute one in a battle with a player or a relationship with a player when you call it a substitute, because so many negative emotions are just associated, and players tend to play with emotions. So we tried to chop that, and by calling it finisher is a step in the right direction. I do think personally that finisher is probably starting to become quite normal in a player's terminology now. So it's how can we then add the next layers? So what we've done now is when we go into clubs, we say, what sort of finisher are you going to be? And we now have, I think we have up to 14 different names for finishers now, but depending on the club I work with, we'll select 4 or 5 so that players can recall them. But closer, energizer, impactor, match winner, decider, exciter, invigorator, all these different things effectively assign a psychological name with a tactical role. So if we're watching Man City and Arsenal yesterday and Arteta's on the bench and he says, look, Jesus, you're going to go and be my closer. You need to go on and promote game management, promote low ball rolling time, go and have really, really, keep the possession stats high, make sure that we are winning this game and that you leave the pitch with the scoreline that you came on with. And that then all of a sudden it adds that next layer to that finisher terminology where players are like, okay, I'm a closer. That's what I'm going to resonate with. That's my role. I'm the closer. And player feedback is brilliant because they love having an assigned role. It puts accountability on them. But the next big thing is, again, it links to thing I touched on a bit earlier, where you're giving them direct information of what you need to do in that game to win it. You're not saying you're going to sub, try and go and see, go and win the game. It's removing those sort of like, I don't know what the right word is, the sort of phrases in football that are almost
like the stigma, I think you would call it, almost like around it.
Exactly that, and you're saying go and be a closer, and that for me is a major development in the psychological and the people sort of part of that process.
You've been mentioning the psychological aspect of it. I think you just gave a great example there, where just changing the label from substitute to finisher almost changes the whole concept of a player. You're not this just useless thing that's sitting on a bench now. You have a role and you have a meaning to what you have to do in that match. Is the psychological aspect a huge part of being a sub, would you say? And I'm curious to dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah, massively. I think it's the biggest part. I think you can have a player who is technically ready, physically ready, and tactically ready, but if they don't feel loved, they don't feel empowered, they're not accepting of their role, they're a little bit resistant, they're a little bit isolated, you're never going to have somebody perform to the best of their ability. And that's not even just in football, that's in general. I went and did a talk in France the other day, and I used the example where just before I came out on stage, if you said to me, we tried to book the throwing coach, but instead we actually got the subs coach, but now go and do your thing, I'd be like, oh God, like what a second choice I am, and it would then take character for me to go, right, I need to deliver now. I need to be what they want from me. And, it's the same concept, of thinking, well, not first choice, so I'm sort of like an afterthought, so excuse me, something's not gone well and they've just sort of like called upon me, and it's trying to remove that stigma and saying, look, we've actually got a role for you. It's a closer. So at half time, we're going to warm you up as a closer. On Friday training, we're going to warm you up as a closer. We're going to build into your mindset the right way to be a closer, and again, you work backwards from that role and it goes through technical, tactical, physical, but psychological is just so important for players to buy in to what we're doing and accept the processes that we're doing.
It's become a huge topical conversation now with the idea of players being overloaded, just too many games, too much playing time. Rodri, I think, was a perfect example. He was complaining about it last week, then tore his ACL this week. Just brutal on the player side of things. Are substitutes becoming even more impactful now? Like, have you seen a trend change now? Because these players are playing so many games, especially when you're looking at the top Premier League teams and so on, where you've got Champions League, you've got FA Cup, you've got all these tournaments now just back to back, the Club World Cup, like it just keeps adding on. And then you've got international fixtures as well. Are substitutes now becoming even more impactful than they ever were?
I think substitutes are being used more than they're ever, sort of been done before, because we're also in this 5 substitution era, aren't we? So they're definitely being used more. Whether I think they're becoming more impactful or not, I personally don't see the trend that, teams are starting to have more goal contributions. Obviously there will be more because you've gone from 3 subs to 5 subs, but not relative to changing to 5 subs. Game state changes, substitution, individual contributions, all the things that they contribute. I don't think there is an incline in that. So I always say the teams that I work with, it's almost moving to 5 subs is almost the best thing for my role, because now I've, like at Wimbledon, we were first in substitute productivity. Well, now you're just going to say, I get to bring on 5 rather than 3, and the opposition might do the same. And if their substitute productivity isn't good, so if they've got the 67% pass completion and the duels lost and it comes to it, I'm going to back our subs over their subs. And so I think what this is offering is teams that utilize their substitutions a clear advantage in today's game, definitely.
I have so many questions, but we'll keep moving on. The second quote is, "It's my job is to make sure players are prepared as possible to go on and impact the game in all ways, physically, mentally, socially, technically, and tactically." So I think we've spoken about quite a few of those, but socially sticks out to me now, as we haven't mentioned too much about that. So I'd love to hear more about that, but then as well, just the overall quote and why you might have said that.
Yeah, so socially almost refers a little bit more to them accepting the role within their squad. So, I sometimes feel substitutes are almost just 7 isolated players, and there's not that unity amongst them. And again, I would never glamorize being a substitute too much that you then devalue a starter, but it's about just trying to enhance that process. And, having 7 individuals on the bench isn't, in a collective team game isn't beneficial. So socially, I sort of refer to how can we create a substitution culture similar to that of a goalkeeper, where it's not 3 individual goalkeepers. I hear all the time, they're referred to as the GK Union, isn't it? And they're a
Yeah.
collective. And if you do well, we do well. And don't get me wrong, I'm going to chase your shirt down and I'm going to do everything I can to push you to become number one. But, Ramsdale's a brilliant example. Aaron Ramsdale, I think, is a really we, not me player. He was obviously disappointed he wasn't starting, but he would never let that disrespect his relationship with Raya or the performance that he deliver. And it's about bringing that socially to our substitutes and thinking, how can we have a substitution culture where you can help that sub go and get ready, and if he gets on and wins us the game, you've still contributed because you've helped your fellow sub. And it's that sort of is what's meant by the social sort of term I refer to there. The obviously the holistic role of psychological, tactical, technical, and physical. Again, I'll give an example. So if we were going to take a closer, it's then about thinking, how can we impact this player in those 4 domains? So psychologically, I need you to accept being a closer. I need you to vision being a closer. I need you to tell me about what it's like to be a closer. Accept the feelings. Accept that that's going to be your role today, is that you're going to be a closer. And I get that you're frustrated you're not starting. And come Monday and Tuesday, we can address that about how can we get you to become a starter. But for the next 48 hours on a Friday, I need you to be my closer for me. So it's about accepting that. The physical side of things is how can we warm you up best so that when you go onto the game, you're physically ready to be a closer, because an energizer is someone who needs to go and have explosive energy and be really ready to, reach their top speed. A closer might be someone who's going to sit in 2 banks of 4 and shuffle and make sure the opposition pass around them. So how do we, again, start a closer and work backwards physically? Technically and tactically, a little bit different, but tactically, sometimes I put sessions on for the substitutes. So on a Friday, how do we do a session that promotes game management? How do we do a session where I'm going to coach to you what you're expecting to see against the opposition when we're 2-0 up, 3-0 up? What do the opposition look like when they're, frantically chasing a game? Because that's what I'm going to try and coach into you so that when you come on, again, there's that no shock, there's no adjusting to the game. We've told you everything that's going to happen. So transition, be comfortable and trust yourself. And again, that links with technically really, as in what sort of KPIs am I expecting from you to go and be a closer? If it's a striker, you might be final third pressures, regains, interception, duels ones, racing chases in the channel. It's about finding technical data that then you can assess that substitute on. So I hope that answers your question.
No, that's a brilliant breakdown. We'll hop back into your career, I guess you could say. Is there a mentor and an influential figure that you had throughout your process of learning and getting a better understanding, or even still to this day, that you can look back at and say, like, he really helped me, or they really helped me move forward in what I was trying to work on?
There's definitely been a lot of people that have helped me, in different parts of my career, whether that be at Bournemouth, Carl Robson was the first person to ever give me a chance in football, and I'll never forget that. He taught me a lot, whether that be Mark Molesley getting me in at Weymouth, whether that be Mark Robinson getting me in at Wimbledon, Matt Crocker, who went to the obviously the US national team. I went to him at Southampton, and he was kind enough to then bring me and invite me to or present to Greg Berhalter and the team. And so there was lots of people in my journey who I am very, very grateful for. And even now I'm doing a little bit of work for Loudoun United, and Coach Ryan Martin is an incredible person who has always been kind enough to try and help me, have an opportunity to demonstrate my work, but has also allowed me to discuss things with him and learn from him. And, I'm very fortunate that I probably never had one like major mentor in my career, but I've had a lot of people that have wanted me to be successful and bring this to, football. And that is something I feel, very, very grateful for.
When we're discussing football, it's very similar to life, where you have these constant highs and lows, and it's just this constant like roller coaster of emotions. I'm curious about a low that you've had throughout. It can be your career or even your personal life that you're now able to look back at and almost use it as inspiration or motivation to keep going.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because I think my personal low would probably be very different to my professional low. My professional lows will come from losses and, days where I've maybe not performed to the ability that I thought I could because something was on my mind, But I would say the personal lows, you go through hardships in life, whether that be mentally, whether that be the car crash, all this sort of stuff. I think the beauty of that is it puts other lows into perspective. So, it puts a loss into perspective. A loss, at 5:30 on a Saturday is the worst thing in the world. But then in half an hour, you remember, what life's about, and you think, yes, it's not ideal we've had that, but come tomorrow morning I'm going to do everything I can to fix that. Whereas I think that's been put into perspective because of the personal lows. You think like nothing will ever, compare to some of the situations I've been in growing up. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's a really nice way to frame that. And it reminds me that there's always going to be a way forward. So the lows don't ever seem too low.
From your research with substitutions and your role that you've been able to have, what's a life lesson or a way that you can draw lessons from that to real life? Like, how can someone take inspiration from your work as a substitutions coach?
I would say there's probably a couple of ways you can interpret that question. I would say if you were a substitute, I always tell them, never give in, never give up. There's always going to be an opportunity, and that's something that is something I resonate with. In that, I might have a few quiet days, or I might have a few quiet games where I don't quite get something that I'm looking for. But that doesn't mean I give up. That doesn't mean I stop showing up and doing the right things. I'm constantly doing that because I believe in the result that I'm looking to achieve, and I'm trying to manifest that into reality. So that would be almost sort of something that I take away almost from myself. And I think that some of the substitutes themselves will apply that to other aspects of their life. I think the journey is that quote against that results over tradition. It's not being accepting of something that's always the way that it's been done. And by all means, if you do the data and you do the research and it is the way, then by all means accept it and continue with it. But don't just accept things because people say that's how it's been done. It's Marcelo Bielsa, I think, has a great quote off the top of my head. It's, everyone is a madman until their idea triumphs. And, I have had a couple of coaches that probably haven't bought into the process, and that's absolutely fine. It's a game of opinions, but that won't ever stop me from thinking I believe this is the right way. The data says so. I've got enough people that believe it. And so it's staying true to what you believe in, I suppose.
Yeah, I have one as well. It's you're crazy until you make it. Very similar to what you just said there, where everyone thinks you're a nutcase until it actually comes through and you become successful.
Exactly.
The next one here, if we had this same conversation 5 to 10 years down the line, what does your career look like? What does your research look like? I'm curious to get some insights on where you think this is sort of headed.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the substitution journey itself could be anywhere. It could be one of the most staple roles in a backroom team, because if 10 years ago, if we'd have looked at set pieces in a backroom team, probably wouldn't have been very existent. Right now, I know that there are teams in step 5 in the English pyramid who have set piece coaches, which is crazy to think that as of a few years ago, there wouldn't have even been analysts in that sort of remit. So the way that sort of has blown up has been brilliant. And it wouldn't surprise me that if, the substitution coach took a similar trend. That being said, I want to win the Premier League. Hopefully in 10 years' time, I've sat here and I've got a medal around my neck.
I hope you have 2 or 3 at least.
Yeah, or maybe an MLS and a Premier League. There you go. All the different leagues. But for me, like, my journey is to just keep continuing to have a footballing legacy. I've always said that the subs journey was one that just gave me a platform, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. And I'm enthusiastic and passionate about subs, and I want to make a difference. But that's not to say that I'm only 27 now. That when I get to 32, 33, and I finally finish my A license and my pro license, then I think now I want to go and be a first team coach again, because that's where I started my journey. I was a first team coach. This has given me an unbelievable platform with some unbelievable experiences and network and opportunities like this. But now I'm ready to go back to being a first team coach. And the subs thing will always stay with me because, it's almost part of my identity now. I can't watch a game of football without looking to see what the subs are doing. But I feel like I have a lot more to offer the footballing world. I think I have a lot more things that I could innovate. I have a lot more things that I could do differently. I have a lot more things that I could bring value to people's processes, not just through substitutes. So I'd like to think that I've continued my footballing legacy down a different pathway or something like that.
We'll wrap up with some quick fire questions here. I want to know, I just thought of it as you mentioned it there. In terms of innovation, what is a similar role that you could see starting to develop now in the future? So we've mentioned subs, we mentioned like a throw-in analyst. Is there another part of the industry that you've seen where you could go, I could really see an analyst starting to grow in that position?
Yeah, I had a brilliant call yesterday actually with someone who is a half-time specialist. He is an unbelievable guy, like real charisma, real passion, just really personable, easy to talk to. And his sort of research has come through the fact that he doesn't think half times are being utilized as best they could. So he goes into teams, and again, it probably wouldn't be a full-time role, but it could be a consultancy role where he goes in and he delivers his research around team talks, and how you can. He just one thing that he referred is just talking about minute 9 is his, I think, the brand of his company, but how you really shouldn't address players until they have completely come down from like the emotional 45 minutes. How managers need to also come completely down before they address players, and I think, again, I've done my own research on how to have team talks with substitutes, and we compared notes, but his takes it to a whole nother level of the different strategies and words and phrases that you can use to stimulate a player in a 15-minute segment with education, motivation, and desire.
The last one here: if you could sit down with one person for a meal, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
So obviously it would always be things like my mum. Do you know what I mean? Because she continues to show strength that I didn't even know existed in people, and knowledge that I think didn't even exist. Again, like, she's just so refreshing to be in the company of. But that would be personally. Professionally, it would probably have to be Sir Alex Ferguson, because I just think he's the best to have ever done it. He's got so much right in his career that it's almost like a football manager career, isn't it? Where you can like quit the game if you lose and go again. He's mastered football, and I think it would be wicked to sit down and hear a little bit more about his processes, his experiences, how he developed into the person and the manager that he sort of became.
Before we wrap things up here, if you have any last words, and also I want to shout out your book. Give us more information. I know you're in the midst of writing and publishing it and everything now. So shout out your book, shout out any of the other work you have, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah, cool. So I've got a book called out. It's called Finishers. It's coming out. I think it's in the sort of production stage at the moment. It's back and forth because obviously we want to get it right. So I'm hoping sort of early November, end of October will be sort of released. So obviously really appreciate the opportunity to get that. And effectively it talks through a little bit more about the journey that I've been through, how it came about, what are some of the strategies I implemented, the clubs I've gone on to consult with, the future of the role, future of me, and all that sort of stuff. And again, lastly, I'll just say, if there's anyone that wants to know a little bit more about their substitutions, then please do reach out, because I've got enough data to show that I can be effective in this role. So I would love to come and be effective for you.
No, that's brilliant. Sammy, I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to speaking again soon.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Chad. Really, really appreciate it.